What would you do if you gave 28 years of your life to one company, only to be replaced by the CEO's niece the day before retirement? That's what happened to Nora Bennett, Senior Director of Strategic Programs at Halpern Dynamics in Arlington, Virginia. She had built her reputation on trust, sacrifice, and results, culminating in a $120 million federal drone logistics contract. But when the CEO tried to hand her life's work to his niece, he forgot one thing: the deal was locked inside Sentinel Gate, a protocol only Nora could open. The morning sun cut through the glass walls of Halpern Dynamics. On her screen, a blinking cursor waited for Nora's final voice verification inside Sentinel Gate, a system she had designed to prevent another cyber breach. One more command, and the contract would be secured. Then the door opened. Richard Halpern, the CEO, entered without knocking. At his side walked Tessa Halpern, just 24, holding a tablet like a prize. "We're initiating a leadership transition," Richard said flatly. "Effective immediately." Nora turned from her monitor. "Immediately? I retire tomorrow." "I only need to." "You've done more than enough," he interrupted. "Tessa will take it from here." Tessa beamed. "This is such an honor," she said, reaching out her hand. Nora didn't move. The system was still alive behind her. Sentinel Gate didn't recognize surnames, or fresh energy, or PR slogans. It recognized her. Calmly, she logged out, without closing the program, and finally shook Tessa's hand. "I hope you know what you're walking into." No applause. No farewell. Just silence, as 28 years of loyalty vanished in seconds. And yet, inside the company's servers, the trap was already waiting. And this was only the beginning. If you want to hear how one quiet executive turned betrayal into corporate chaos, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon. Because what came next would shake Halpern Dynamics to its core. When Nora released Tessa's hand, the weight of 28 years pressed against her chest like a stone. The handshake had felt hollow, a polite gesture masking the cruelty of what had just been done. She turned, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor, and stepped into the corridor that suddenly felt foreign. It was the same hallway she had walked thousands of times, yet now it seemed narrower, colder, as though the walls themselves had conspired to erase her. Colleagues who once sought her advice couldn't lift their eyes. One man she had mentored years ago pretended to be on a phone call, speaking into a dead receiver. Another woman typed furiously on a keyboard that wasn't even powered on. Silence spread like fog, thick and deliberate. Nobody wanted to be caught looking at her, as if compassion itself was dangerous. At her office, a cardboard box already sat waiting by her chair, the kind used for quick exits, efficient, impersonal, the corporate version of a body bag. Nora blinked at it, realizing the office manager must have dropped it off while she was being replaced in the conference room. She lowered herself into her chair, the familiar leather creaking beneath her, and exhaled slowly. On the desk, everything seemed exactly as it had been yesterday, but the illusion shattered when her gaze shifted to the glass wall outside. The nameplate that once read Nora Bennett, Senior Director of Strategic Programs, was gone. In its place gleamed a brand new placard, Tessa Halpern, Director of Emerging Ventures. The words stung not just because they replaced her, but because they cheapened the role into something vague and hollow. Emerging Ventures. It sounded like an unpaid internship disguised as a promotion. She reached into her top drawer, pulling out the objects that had carried her through countless late nights, a worn leather notebook filled with client notes, a fountain pen from her first international deal, a packet of emergency Tylenol, and a faded photo of the company's founding team. Some faces in the picture were long gone, retired, poached by rivals, or buried. She traced the edge of the frame with her finger before setting it carefully into the box. Then she began moving through the motions, lifting books, stacking files, sliding binders she had personally written into the container. A framed certificate from a procurement conference in Zurich clinked against the glass, its significance reduced to just another object to be packed away. As her hands worked mechanically, her mind churned. 28 years of contracts, negotiations, and strategy now distilled into a single box of leftovers. Outside her door, she could hear the muted footsteps of staff hurrying by, avoiding the awkwardness of offering a goodbye. She had expected at least a card, a handshake, maybe even a simple thank you. Instead, she was being scrubbed out of the company's memory like chalk from a board. The absence of recognition hurt more than the replacement itself. It was one thing to be pushed aside, it was another to be erased. She turned back to her computer one last time, fingers hovering over the keyboard. With deliberate calm, she logged in using her administrator credentials. Her access was still live, for now. She didn't touch anything that could damage the company, but she deleted every personal document, every memo she had written, every training manual she had painstakingly created. They wanted her gone? Then they would no longer have her words to lean on. The only thing she left untouched was Sentinel Gate, the hidden protocol nested deep in the system. To anyone else, it looked like a harmless script, but it carried the biometric encryption required to trigger the final release of the $120 million contract. That lock remained invisible, waiting, a silent guardian tied only to her. Closing the laptop, Nora leaned back, taking in the hollow shell of what had once been her command post. The office no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the narrative they were constructing, a story where she had never existed and Tessa had always been the future. Bitterness burned in her throat, but she swallowed it down, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of tears. She taped the box shut, sealing away the fragments of her career, and stood. For a moment she lingered, eyes on the screensaver that glowed softly in the darkened monitor, as though the system itself were watching her leave. Carrying the box, she walked toward the elevator. Each step echoed louder than it should have, bouncing off the sterile walls. No one stopped her. No one spoke. The silence was suffocating, yet within it lay a strange power. They could pretend she was gone, but they couldn't erase what she had built. As the elevator doors slid closed, she caught one last glimpse of the new nameplate gleaming on her office door, her legacy already replaced by nepotism in glittering letters. The descent felt endless. By the time the doors opened to the lobby, she had composed herself. The security guard at the desk gave a polite nod but avoided direct eye contact, as if instructed not to engage. Outside, the crisp Arlington air met her face, cool and sharp, cutting away the haze of the office. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, she stepped onto the sidewalk without a badge hanging from her neck. She was free, but the freedom carried the weight of betrayal. Nora walked slowly to her car, setting the box carefully on the passenger seat. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles pale. 28 years of loyalty ended not with applause, not with gratitude, but with a silent exit no one dared witness. Yet as she sat there, a flicker of clarity steadied her. They had taken her title, her office, her name on the wall. But the one thing they couldn't take was the system she had built. Sentinel Gate still carried her voice, her signature, her imprint. And sooner or later, the company would discover that erasing her came with a cost they weren't prepared to pay. With that thought, she started the engine. The car hummed to life, carrying her away from the glass towers of Halpern Dynamics. Behind her, the company celebrated its shiny new air. Ahead of her, unknown horizons stretched wide. Nora gripped the wheel tighter, her resolve hardening. They thought they had written her out of the story, but she knew better. The real story was only beginning. Nora's quiet exit should have been the end of her story inside Halpern Dynamics. Yet as she drove away from the Arlington headquarters with a cardboard box on the passenger seat, the company wasted no time rewriting history. Within 24 hours, the narrative machine roared to life. Press releases hit inboxes across Washington. LinkedIn lit up with polished graphics. Headlines screamed about a bold new era under fresh leadership at Halpern Dynamics. And front and center of it all was Tessa Halpern, sitting in the very chair Nora had just left behind, smiling as if she had earned it. The first email Nora stumbled upon came from an industry newsletter she had subscribed to years ago. The subject line read, "Rising star Tessa Halpern secures landmark $120 million federal deal." Nora clicked, jaw tight. There she was as Tessa, posing in her new office, legs crossed, glittering heels catching the camera light. The caption beneath the photo made Nora's stomach turn. Photographed in her Arlington office, where the strategic contract was finalized. They hadn't even bothered to crop out Nora's mug, the one given by her assistant 5 birthdays ago, sitting on the desk as if it now belonged to Tessa's legacy. The article itself was a cascade of empty praise. Words like intuition, agility, and vision were strung together to paint a portrait of brilliance. Yet behind every line, Nora could see the hollow truth. Tessa hadn't sat through those midnight negotiations. She hadn't flown across the Atlantic during a rail strike to salvage a collapsing clause. She hadn't rewritten compliance terms 4 times over under the pressure of government lawyers. All of that had been Nora's work, sweat, and sacrifice. And yet here was Tessa, basking in the spotlight, her youth and surname presented as if they alone had carried the company into triumph. The video interview was worse. Nora pressed play reluctantly, half hoping it might be less painful than she expected. It wasn't. Tessa leaned into the camera like a TED speaker, rehearsed and gleaming. "This deal really came down to bold intuition," she said confidently. "When I looked at the numbers, I just knew it was time to push forward." She stumbled over the client's name, Frontier Aerotronics. And Nora winced. It wasn't Frontier Aerotronics. It was Frontier Aerologics, one of the most established names in defense logistics. The mispronunciation alone betrayed how little Tessa understood about the client, the industry, or the stakes. But the audience didn't care. Comments flooded the video within minutes. "Inspiring young leadership," one user wrote. "Proof that legacy titles need to make way for fresh voices," another declared. Nora scrolled through them with clenched teeth, feeling as though she were watching years of experience drowned under a tidal wave of hashtags and buzzwords. The worst part wasn't that people believed it, it was that Halpern Dynamics wanted them to. Back at headquarters, the celebration grew louder. Employees were pressured to share the official post announcing Tessa's promotion. The communications team circulated glossy infographics branding her as the next generation of leadership. Even Richard appeared in a staged photo beside her, hand on her shoulder like a proud mentor passing the torch. To the outside world, it looked flawless. To Nora, it was a grotesque theater of lies. She sat in her apartment that evening, laptop glowing against the dim light, and watched it all unfold. Post after post, article after article, each one erasing her name further. She was no longer the architect of the contract, no longer the steady hand behind the system. According to the world, Tessa Halpern had walked in, taken charge, and secured the most important deal of the decade. Anger surged, but beneath it lay something sharper, clarity. Nora realized this wasn't just nepotism, it was hubris. They were so desperate to parade youth and family name that they had overlooked the very foundation holding the deal together. Sentinel Gate still blinked in silence, waiting for her voice, her terminal, her command. Every headline, every interview, every LinkedIn post was built on a victory they had not yet secured. And when the truth surfaced, and she knew it would, the fall would be devastating. For now, she remained quiet, invisible, letting the illusion spread. She closed the laptop and stared out the window at the Arlington skyline. The city glittered like Tessa's shoes, flashy, temporary, pretty under lights but useless in a storm. Nora whispered to herself, "They think they've won." And then, after a pause, she added, "But the system knows better." And this illusion of victory couldn't last forever. Because while Halpern Dynamics plastered Tessa's face across headlines, the system inside their servers was already rejecting her authority. In the next part, you'll see exactly how that illusion shattered, and how panic spread from the top floor to every corner of the company. But here's a question for you. If you were Nora, would you stay silent and let them crash, or step in before everything burned? Drop your thoughts in the comments, I'm curious where you stand. The illusion couldn't last forever. While headlines celebrated Tessa's so-called triumph, the truth was already festering inside Halpern Dynamics servers. By the third morning after Nora's departure, the boardroom lights in Arlington burned long before sunrise. What was supposed to be a flawless handoff had transformed into a silent crisis, one that PR slogans couldn't disguise. It started with a simple ping. Jacob Miller, a young IT analyst who had shadowed Nora for years, noticed something strange in the execution logs. Every attempt to finalize the $120 million federal drone contract returned the same blunt message: Gateway Final Authorization failed, security environment mismatch. At first he thought it was a glitch. But when the error repeated again and again, despite resets, fresh logins, even manual overrides, Jacob realized it wasn't a bug. It was SentinelGate doing exactly what it had been built to do. In the executive conference room, Tessa Halpern sat at Nora's old desk, frustration painted across her face. She clicked and re-clicked, nails tapping impatiently on the trackpad. Each attempt ended the same way: rejection. Behind her, assistants shifted nervously while Richard paced the length of the glass wall, jaw tight, hands clenched. Why isn't this going through? Tessa snapped at Brent, the weary IT lead. Brent rubbed his temples. Because the system is recognizing the request, but it's flagging a mismatch. The terminal you're using isn't the registered origin node. Richard froze. In English, Brent. Brent swallowed hard. It means the contract can only be executed from the original machine where it was engineered, Nora Bennett's workstation. And it requires her biometric voice verification. A heavy silence fell over the room. Tessa's eyes widened, disbelief breaking through her polished facade. So you're telling me we can't sign this contract because of a computer setting? Brent shook his head. It's not just a setting. SentinelGate was designed to prevent exactly this kind of substitution. It has 3 layers of lock: device, location, and voice. Even if we cloned her computer, it wouldn't matter. Without Nora, the system won't authorize. Richard cursed under his breath and stabbed at his phone. Get Jessica Collins on the line. Now. Moments later, the former chief security officer, now working at a compliance firm downtown, appeared on speaker. Her voice carried the weight of someone who already knew what was coming. Yes, Richard, it's true, she said. Nora implemented the SentinelGate protocol last year after the breach scare. You signed off on it yourself. We called it excessive but clever. Remember? Richard's face drained of color. Around the table, executives shifted in their seats. Tessa looked from one to the other, panic creeping into her voice. There must be a way to bypass it. Can't we just reset the system? Jessica's tone hardened. Not without corrupting the entire contract log. And if you tamper with it, Frontier-era logics will see the inconsistency. You'd be starting from scratch, and worse, you'd be caught manipulating government paperwork. The words landed like a hammer. For a company built on contracts, the suggestion of tampering was toxic. Richard ended the call abruptly, but the damage was done. The room now buzzed with whispers, the weight of failure pressing down. Meanwhile, across town, Nora sat at her kitchen table, coffee growing cold beside her. Her phone buzzed with a single message from Jacob: they're panicking. She stared at the screen, lips curving into the faintest smile. SentinelGate wasn't sabotaging anything, it was simply following the rules she had built. The company had erased her name, but they could not erase her code. Back at headquarters, the situation spiraled. Tessa tried again, this time on a different laptop, her voice rising as each denial message appeared in stark red font. Access denied. Invalid biometric ID. Terminal mismatch. Incident logged. The phrase repeated until it felt like mockery. Reporters were already sniffing around. A leak from compliance had hinted at internal security conflicts delaying the contract. By mid-morning, Defense Industry Daily ran a story titled, Halpern Dynamics faces execution roadblock on $120 million deal. Richard slammed his fist against the table. Who leaked that? No one answered. The truth was too obvious. The walls were closing in. The company had built an illusion of victory around Tessa, plastering her face across headlines and internal emails. But now that illusion was cracking. Shareholders were calling. The client was asking questions. And in every corner of the building, employees whispered the same thing: without Nora, the deal was doomed. Across the city, Nora scrolled through the breaking news, the irony not lost on her. She had walked out quietly, no threats, no revenge. Yet her absence had become louder than any speech she could have given. The foundation she built refused to recognize the imposters sitting in her chair. And now the entire company was discovering that legacy isn't something you can fake with press releases, it's coded deep, in ways you can't overwrite. And this was only the beginning of Halpern Dynamics unraveling. Because if the system refused to recognize Tessa, the next question was inevitable: how long before the client realized the truth? And once they did, would the entire deal collapse? What do you think? Should Nora stay silent and let Halpern burn, or should she step back in before the fallout destroys everything? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. By dawn the following day, the illusion had collapsed completely. The marble halls of Halpern Dynamics no longer carried the sound of authority and confidence. Instead, they echoed with panic. Reporters were circling like vultures, and the once proud Arlington headquarters felt less like a fortress of defense innovation and more like a besieged castle. At 6:45 a.m., the respected industry journal Aerotimes released a headline that sent shockwaves across Washington: Halpern Dynamics fails to authorize $120 million contract, protocol locked to ousted executive. The article did not speculate, it cited leaked internal emails showing Brent, the IT director, admitting that the contract could not be executed without Nora Bennett's biometric authorization. Within minutes, screenshots of those emails went viral. Former employees posted them on LinkedIn with captions dripping with scorn: "This is what happens when you replace decades of expertise with nepotism." On Twitter, defense analysts mocked the fiasco, one writing, "Imagine losing a federal deal because you fired the only person who knew how to finish it." What had begun as a celebration of a new era had turned into an industry-wide spectacle of arrogance and failure. Inside the executive conference room, Richard Halpern slammed the door so hard the glass rattled. His phone had not stopped buzzing since dawn with calls from furious shareholders demanding answers. No one in the room dared to speak. Tessa sat rigid at the table, pale and wide-eyed, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The niece who had been paraded as the future face of Halpern Dynamics had become the symbol of its humiliation in less than 2 days. Brent tried to explain, his voice subdued. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Without Nora's biometric input, SentinelGate won't allow execution. Every attempt logs another rejection. And now the client knows. Richard's face twisted in fury. Frontier Aerologics called me at 5 this morning. They're demanding answers by noon. If they walk, this company loses more than the contract, we lose our credibility. His gaze shifted sharply toward his niece. Tessa, what do you have to say for yourself? She stumbled over her words. I did what I was told. The comms team said to push confidence, to show leadership. How was I supposed to know about some hidden lock? From the corner, Jacob finally spoke, his young voice cutting through the silence. It wasn't hidden. Nora explained it last year when SentinelGate was installed. It was signed off by compliance. Everyone knew, you just chose not to care. The room went still. Tessa blinked rapidly, unable to respond. Richard's glare could have frozen stone. The truth, spoken aloud, stripped away the last veil of control. At 10:05 a.m., the board convened an emergency video call. Their faces filled the giant screen at the end of the room, each one taut with anger. How could you let this happen? Demanded one investor. Why was an inexperienced junior executive presented as the closer of $100 million deal? Another voice cut in, sharper still. Your leadership transition has cost us 10% of our market cap in less than a week. This isn't a hiccup. It's negligence. Richard tried to spin the narrative, but the evidence was stacked against him: leaked rejection logs, email chains, even the public interview where Tessa had mispronounced the client's name. There was no hiding the truth anymore. Meanwhile, in her apartment across town, Nora watched the chaos unfold on her laptop. News feeds refreshed every few minutes with new angles of the disaster. Clips of Tessa's beaming interview played side by side with screenshots of the error messages, commentators laughing at the contrast. Her phone buzzed again with a message from Jacob, bored, blaming Richard. Tessa pulled from projects. Collapse coming. Nora leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting toward the skyline. She hadn't spoken a single word publicly, yet her silence was louder than every headline. The system she built was speaking for her. By noon, the worst had arrived. Frontier Aerologics issued a statement suspending the $120 million agreement, citing protocol discrepancies and leadership mismanagement. The words were clinical, but the effect was devastating. Reporters swarmed the Arlington headquarters, cameras capturing employees slipping out with grim faces. The stock plummeted another 9% before closing. Inside, Richard barked into his phone, promising solutions he didn't have. Tessa had vanished, her once gleaming promotion now an anchor tied around her family's neck. Brent submitted his resignation quietly that afternoon, unwilling to absorb the fallout. What had been marketed as a new era now stood exposed as a monument to arrogance and erasure. And through it all, Nora remained still. She had not sabotaged anything, had not whispered a word to the press. She had simply built a system strong enough to withstand incompetence, one that recognized only integrity and original authorship. The very system they dismissed was now defending her legacy, louder than any speech she could have given. But the question is this: if you were in Nora's place, would you take satisfaction in watching the empire that betrayed you collapse under its own weight, or would you intervene before the fire burned it all to the ground? The collapse inside Halpern Dynamics might have been contained if the client had remained in the dark, but contracts of that magnitude are never sheltered for long. At Frontier Aerologics' headquarters in Dallas, the compliance team was already poring over every line of the final documents. They had grown uneasy after days of silence from Halpern, and when they compared the last version signed with Nora to the one delivered after her departure, discrepancies jumped out immediately. Formatting shifts, altered clauses, redated approvals, tiny things most would overlook, but to an experienced eye, they looked like tampering. And at the very bottom of page 42, one line glowed like a warning beacon: confirmation pending via Sentinel Gate, origin biometric required. Marcus Levinson, Senior Procurement Director, had been in the trenches with Nora for months, late-night calls across time zones, back-and-forth edits over compliance. He knew her meticulous habits. He also knew she would never have left a clause unresolved. Holding the papers in his hands, he frowned, realizing the truth: the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. And Halpern Dynamics had tried to slide something past them after pushing Nora out. By mid-morning, Marcus dialed Richard directly. The call was clipped, tense, hostile from the start. "Richard," Marcus said, his voice calm but edged with steel, "why wasn't Frontier Aerologics informed of the leadership transition? And why does the final contract log show edits that were never approved by our side?" On the other end, Richard stumbled for words, blaming technical issues, miscommunication, internal adjustments. But Marcus wasn't buying it. "This isn't a typo," he pressed. "This is protocol manipulation. You expect us to execute on a contract that your own system won't authorize?" Richard's evasions only deepened the suspicion. Marcus ended the call coldly, saying only, "We'll be conducting an internal review. Don't expect further cooperation until this is resolved." That single sentence carried more weight than any press headline. To lose trust with Frontier wasn't just losing a deal, it was losing standing with the entire defense sector. Across town, Nora sat at her kitchen table, the morning sun spilling across the wood. She had tried to ignore the storm, telling herself she had walked away. But then her phone buzzed with a number she hadn't expected to see, Marcus Levinson. She hesitated for only a moment before answering. His voice was low, deliberate. "Nora, I need to ask you something off the record. Did you build a biometric gateway into the final contract system, one that ties execution to a specific device and voice?" Nora closed her eyes briefly, then exhaled. "I did. It was authorized internally after the security scare last year. You and I reviewed the clause in version 7. On the line, Marcus cursed softly. Then they've been lying to us. Richard and his team are acting like this is just an IT hiccup, but the metadata doesn't match. They redated approvals, reformatted clauses. They tried to fake finalization." Nora's silence told him everything. He continued, voice heavy with both frustration and admiration. "They erased your name from the deal, Nora, but the system still knows you were there. And right now, it's protecting us from them." She allowed herself a faint smile, one he couldn't see. "The system wasn't built to remember names," she said quietly. "It was built to detect absence." That afternoon, the news hit the wires again, this time not from leaks but from Frontier itself. Their public statement was cautious but damning. Due to unresolved discrepancies in the execution documents, Frontier Aerologics is freezing the $120 million procurement contract with Halpern Dynamics pending full review. Within minutes, every analyst in Washington was dissecting the announcement. Words like tampering, misrepresentation, and loss of trust flooded the headlines. Investors recoiled. The stock, already wounded, dropped another 5%. Employees whispered in hallways, wondering not if, but when heads would roll. Inside Halpern Dynamics, Richard slammed his phone against the desk, face pale, veins pulsing at his temple. "They're freezing it," he muttered. Around him, the executive team sat in silence, their careers unraveling by the hour. Tessa, once photographed as the triumphant new leader, stared blankly at her tablet, unable to process the speed at which adoration had turned into disgrace. The PR team scrambled, but there was no spin strong enough to rewrite a contract log. Nora, however, didn't rush to the cameras or fire off statements. She didn't need to. The truth had surfaced on its own, carried not by her words but by the system she had coded. Sentinel Gate wasn't revenge, it was insurance. Insurance against arrogance, against shortcuts, against the belief that legacy could be erased without consequence. Now, that insurance had spoken louder than any press release. As dusk fell, Marcus called her again. His voice was calmer this time, even respectful. "We'll hold the line, Nora. They can't execute without you, and they know it. But I need you to understand, what happens next depends on you. Do you want to stay silent and let them drown, or do you want to step back into the storm?" Nora stood by the window, looking out at the glowing Arlington skyline. She didn't answer immediately. For 28 years she had carried the company, only to be cast aside in silence. Now the silence was hers to command. She knew one thing for certain, Halpern Dynamics had wanted a future without her, but their client had just reminded them that the future still needed her voice. The freeze from Frontier Aerologics was the final blow Richard Halpern could no longer ignore. With the company bleeding value by the hour and the board on the verge of mutiny, he had only one option left: face the woman he had tried to erase. 3 days after the suspension, he walked into a modest brick building off Lexington Avenue, far from the glass towers he was used to. The plaque by the door read, "Miriam Hensley, Attorney at Law." Nora was already seated inside the glass-walled conference room, calm in a way only someone holding all the cards could be. At her side sat Miriam, her longtime legal counsel, eyes sharp behind her glasses. A folder of documents lay neatly on the table, its edges aligned with surgical precision. Richard entered alone, shoulders heavy, tie loosened, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. He forced a smile. Nora. Thank you for meeting. She didn't return the gesture. You know why we're here. He sank into the chair opposite, his voice low but urgent. The client is holding us hostage. The deal is frozen, shareholders are panicking, the press is circling like sharks. We need you back to unlock Sentinel Gate. Just one authorization, that's all. Miriam slid the folder toward him, her tone cutting. This isn't a matter of favors. This is a matter of legal ownership. Nora designed Sentinel Gate under a signed agreement with your former CTO. These documents confirm her authorship and conditional control. You can't compel her to act without breaching contract law. Richard flipped through the pages, his hand trembling slightly. The signatures were clear, the timestamps undeniable. His last defenses crumbled. I'm not here to argue about paperwork, he muttered. I'm here to save the company. Nora leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. Save it? You erased me, Richard. No transition, no acknowledgement, no courtesy. You handed my life's work to your niece and paraded her as if she'd built it. Now that the system won't bend, suddenly I matter again? Her voice didn't rise, but each word cut deeper than a shout. He dropped his gaze. We made mistakes. I made mistakes. But you can still fix this. She let the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Finally, she said, fixing this would mean stepping back into the fire you started. Why should I burn for you? For the first time, Richard's composure cracked. His voice wavered, almost pleading. Name your price. Bonus, equity, title, anything. Just help us close this deal before it destroys us all. Miriam shook her head firmly. This isn't about numbers. Legacy isn't for sale. Nora stood slowly, smoothing her blazer, her tone calm but razor-sharp. You wanted a future without me, Richard. Now you have it. Don't ask me to clean up the ashes. He scrambled, desperation seeping through. The board will think you orchestrated this. The press already speculates. Help us, and at least you can clear your name. She stopped at the door, turned, and looked at him one last time. My name doesn't need clearing. Your system already proved the truth. It remembered me when you didn't. Legacy isn't erased by a press release, it's carved into the foundation. With that, she walked out, leaving Richard slumped in his chair, clutching a folder that spelled out his failure in black and white. Outside, the late afternoon sun dipped behind the skyline. Nora stepped onto the sidewalk, breathing in the crisp air. For the first time in decades, she wasn't the one under pressure. She wasn't a scapegoat or a backup plan. She was the author, and the system still bore her signature. And so the question lingers, if you were Nora, would you take the deal, step back into the company that betrayed you, and reclaim control, or would you walk away forever, letting their empire crumble under its own arrogance? Richard Halpern left Miriam Hensley's law office with the weight of inevitability pressing down on his shoulders. He had entered hoping to negotiate, maybe even intimidate, but he had walked out with nothing but a folder full of proof that his empire no longer belonged to him. Outside, the late afternoon traffic roared down Lexington Avenue, but inside his chest there was only silence, a silence that reminded him of Nora's final words, legacy isn't for sale. That silence followed him back to Arlington, where the real fallout was already underway. By the next morning, the news cycle had moved from speculation to certainty. Frontier Aerologics released a formal termination notice. Due to unresolved discrepancies in security protocols and leadership mismanagement, Frontier Aerologics is withdrawing from the $120 million agreement with Halpern Dynamics effective immediately. The statement didn't mention Nora by name, but it might as well have. Every analyst, every journalist, every industry insider knew the truth. Halpern Dynamics had destroyed itself by trying to erase the very architect of its success. The stock collapsed within hours, plunging nearly 12% before trading was halted. Reporters camped outside the Arlington headquarters, shoving microphones at any employee unlucky enough to walk through the glass doors. Investors demanded emergency calls. Government partners quietly began reviewing their own contracts with Halpern, fearful that Sentinel Gate or similar systems might reveal other fractures. What had begun as a leadership transition had spiraled into a crisis of trust. And in defense contracting, trust was everything. Inside the building, the atmosphere was suffocating. Employees avoided eye contact, afraid that even a glance could implicate them in the disaster. Slack channels buzzed with rumors. Tessa had been removed from all active projects, Brent had resigned in shame, and Richard was facing a no-confidence vote from the board. The once proud executive wing now felt like a ghost town, its glass walls reflecting only hollow promises and broken reputations. For Tessa, the fall was swift and merciless. The same publications that had run glowing features about her fresh energy now splashed her photo beside words like incompetence and nepotism. A clip of her mispronouncing the client's name resurfaced online, racking up millions of views with mocking captions, "This is who replaced 28 years of experience?" She stopped showing up at the office altogether, her legacy sealed not as a visionary, but as a cautionary tale. Richard's fate was no kinder. At an emergency board meeting that Friday, directors grilled him relentlessly. "You signed off on Sentinel Gate," one said. "You paraded your niece instead of preparing a real succession plan," another added. He tried to argue that the company could recover, that one lost deal wasn't the end, but the evidence was too damning, the damage too visible. When the vote came, the decision was unanimous. Richard Halpern was removed as CEO, effective immediately. Across town, Nora read the headlines from the quiet corner of a cafe. She had not sought revenge, but she could not deny the sharp satisfaction of seeing truth revealed without her having to utter a single word. Sentinel Gate had done the speaking for her. The same system they had dismissed as excessive had become her final witness, showing the world that competence could not be erased by nepotism, nor could loyalty be discarded without consequence. That afternoon, her phone rang. It was Marcus Levinson from Frontier Aerologics. His voice carried none of the strain it had during their late-night calls, only steadiness. "Nora, we've made our decision," he said. "We'd like to retain you, not as a vendor, not as a contractor, but as an independent advisor with full discretion. We don't want Halpern Dynamics, we want you." For a moment, Nora closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. She had given 28 years to a company that erased her overnight, and in less than a week, the industry had given her back everything they had stolen: respect, recognition, and choice. Meanwhile, Halpern Dynamics faced a future it could no longer control. Analysts labeled it a cautionary tale of arrogance. Investors whispered about a takeover. Employees polished resumes under their desks. And through it all, the empty office where Nora once sat remained locked, Sentinel Gate still coded into its machine like an unbroken vow. The story was no longer about a lost contract. It was about the cost of erasing legacy, the danger of confusing a last name with real leadership. Nora had walked away quietly, but her silence had roared louder than any press conference. She didn't need to fight to be seen. The cracks in the foundation had spoken for her. And so the question now falls to you: if you were Nora, offered a chance to step into a new role with a client who values you, while your old company collapses in disgrace, would you take the offer and build something new? Or would you simply watch the empire that betrayed you sink into the ashes it created? The collapse of Halpern Dynamics dominated headlines for days, but Nora Bennett had already moved beyond it. While analysts picked apart the wreckage and shareholders demanded explanations, she was seated in a sunlit workspace uptown, a sleek laptop before her, a cappuccino at her side, and no chain of command to answer to. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, her time was her own. The call from Marcus Levinson had not been a lifeline, it had been an invitation. Frontier Aerologics didn't want Halpern Dynamics, and they certainly didn't want the hollow image of leadership Richard had tried to sell them. They wanted Nora, her judgment, her process, the quiet resilience that had carried a $120 million deal across borders and time zones. 2 days later, the papers were signed. The terms were almost surreal: complete autonomy, a compensation package that dwarfed her old salary, and the freedom to choose her projects and hours. Nora didn't hesitate. She had spent too long bending herself to the rhythms of others, answering to executives who saw her as replaceable. Now she answered only to her own standards. As she placed her signature on the final page, she realized the irony. Halpern Dynamics had fought to erase her name, yet here it was again, written in bold ink, sealing a partnership more powerful than any title she had ever held. The news of her new role spread quietly at first, whispered among industry circles, then carried into trade journals. Some framed it as poetic justice, the architect of Sentinel Gate rising from the ashes of the company that betrayed her. Others called it a lesson in institutional knowledge, proof that systems and reputations are built on people, not titles. To Nora, it wasn't about revenge or redemption, it was about clarity. She no longer needed to prove her worth to those who had dismissed it. She had chosen a path where her work spoke for itself. Meanwhile, Halpern Dynamics stumbled deeper into chaos. Richard was gone, stripped of his CEO title after a unanimous vote of no confidence. Tessa had disappeared from the spotlight, her LinkedIn quietly updated with vague words like transitioning and exploring opportunities. Employees fled in droves, contracts evaporated, and whispers of a takeover grew louder. The empire that once seemed untouchable had become a case study in hubris. Nora did not gloat. She simply observed, sipping her coffee in peace, knowing the foundation had spoken louder than she ever could. One Friday afternoon, she returned to the cafe where she had first watched the company unravel. The barista remembered her and placed a small chocolate square beside her cup. "On the house," she said with a smile. Nora thanked her and took a seat by the window, the city bustling outside. She opened her laptop, not to firefight another crisis, but to draft her first advisory report for Frontier-era Logics. The difference was profound: no one hovering over her shoulder, no hidden agendas, no politics, just the work itself, pure and unencumbered. Her phone buzzed with a message from Jacob, the young IT analyst who had been caught in the storm. Board replaced Richard. Interim CEO from outside. They're still trying to rebuild. Just thought you'd want to know. Nora smiled faintly and typed back, "Told you the system never forgets its author." She closed the phone and leaned back, the satisfaction not of triumph, but of release. She had not clawed her way back into Halpern Dynamics, she had walked away, and in doing so, found more power than she ever imagined. The skyline glowed as the sun dipped, glass towers shimmering gold in the fading light. Nora sat still, calm, centered. She wasn't anyone's backup plan, wasn't a placeholder waiting to be replaced. She was the plan. She had proven that legacy cannot be stolen, that integrity always leaves a trace, and that silence can sometimes speak louder than screams. And so her story closes not with bitterness, but with clarity. She had been forced out, erased, mocked, and yet when the dust settled, she was the one left standing, stronger than before. Legacy, after all, isn't written in press releases or corporate memos. It is carved into the systems, the contracts, the relationships built on trust. It endures because truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds oxygen. So let me ask you, if you were in Nora's position, would you take the new beginning offered to you and build a future on your own terms, or would you look back, unable to let go of the empire that once defined you? Comment your thoughts below, and let's see how many of you would choose rebirth over revenge.